Welcome to the Project Endure podcast, the place where we talk about life, endurance, persistence, perspective, and so much more. I'm Joe Rinaldi, and I'll be your host. Let's jump in. Before we get started, let me thank you for being here. The stories on this podcast are meant to let you know that you're not alone in what you're going through and that we can all find strength in struggle with the right perspective. If you've been enjoying the podcast, let me ask that you leave a review on your platform of choice to help us grow so that we can continue to make the world a better place, one conversation at a time. Now, let's get to the episode. Welcome back to the Project Endure podcast, episode 114. We have myself, Joe Rinaldi, and we have a very, very special guest out in Illinois, Nick Goodin. Nick, how are you, man?
Good, man. Grateful to be here today, and thank you for holding some space for us to have a conversation.
Absolutely. I couldn't be more excited for this conversation. It's been in the works for a little while. And our mutual friend, Pete Nelson, who is also on the podcast, connected us. And so any friend of Pete is automatically a friend of mine. And we've also connected previously. But for people who don't know who you are, how would you introduce yourself?
Wow, what a great question. Well, first of all, let me say a big shout out to Pete as well. We both have kind of this shared background, but on different spectrums. Him on the heat side of the world, over in the sauna world, and me on the ice side of the world, over here in the ice barrel world. How I would describe myself is a storyteller, to be honest with you. Knowing that at the end of the day, most of the human mind runs on narrative. And so I feel like if I had to have, what connects all the dots in my life along the way, it's always been storytelling at some part. And whether that's writing and creating, making stories through marketing or through video, through storytelling, or the narratives, again, we tell ourselves, and leading the team here at Ice Barrel and helping them be really the most creative and prolific team, I believe, in the world. And I think that all goes along with, again, stories and how those shape the way we see the world and where those stories come from and how they're currently maybe holding us back from our true potential.
Lot to talk about there. And I am very, very excited to dig into your story. But first, when did you first realize you had a passion for storytelling?
Yeah, probably when I was really young. And that probably was more consuming story. Grew up in a big family, lots of great aunts and uncles around. And it would be very common to have any Saturday night be just this large family around a fire and all of them telling stories about like when they were little or when Uncle blah, 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 went to take a drink of his beer and there were tadpoles in it or something like that. And those moments always intrigue me, that moment where there's tension and, your expectation as a listener starts to build. And then there's some sort of payoff for the character in the story. And again, I think that's when I first noticed that. And then it probably wasn't later, like much later, maybe in my late 20s, that I could actually put language to what all of this was throughout life, that showed up in lots of different disciplines, lots of different work. And now as I look back, it's clearly evident that that was like the main thread so far in life that's woven into everything.
When I think of storytelling, I immediately go back to 2020. It was the spring of 2020. My wife and I had planned our wedding for the June June of 2020, and we had to make this tough decision to postpone the ceremony. And I remember going on this walk. I was just overwhelmed. I was feeling like a victim. And I had this moment of awareness where I realized I was in the story. And a lot of times we look back on our life and we reshape the story, we reframe the narrative. But I had this awareness that I was in the story and I could write it in that moment. And I didn't need to go back and rewrite it. I could be proud of how I responded to those circumstances in that moment. And I had the pen in my hand. And
Mm.
I'm curious if you've had moments like that in your life where, there's this awareness in this moment, knowing that you were about to make a pivotal decision or you just had the control of the choices you were making. I'd love to hear if there were any of those in your life.
Yeah, it's a great example that you just gave, of being able to take agency in a moment and realize that you have a lot more authority over maybe not everything that happens, but how you respond to everything that happens. And that response can actually have physical effects on your emotional well-being at that moment and continual. Also, it can have real impact on your future, right? If nothing's ever going to go my way, nothing probably will ever go your way. So, yeah, I mean, there's probably too many stories like that to tell. But I will tell one story I think's really connected to anybody that's on a journey where they feel like there's something more. And I think we're probably always on that journey. I think we're always evolving. There's always something more, but you're really at that place where everything just feels a little bit stuck. And, 2015 or 2015, I found myself in a place where my first kind of entrepreneurial endeavor in the world had been wildly successful. Was really proud of the work that myself and a team was doing, but I was at the end of my rope, just burned out, and did not have the tools at the time to process what was happening, besides like the tools that I came to the work I was doing with, which is usually how it goes, and um, the tools I needed just weren't around me at that moment. And all I knew was what was happening currently wasn't working. And so just even choosing to let go of a narrative, and the narrative for me at that time was, this is my identity, this thing that I've built. Everybody knows me for this, like I guess regionally in my area knows me for this. And um and I actually genuinely enjoy the work I'm doing. I enjoy the impact it's having. Like there's so much I love about it. But it was one of those things where I did not have the tools to know how to grow interpersonally. And that interpersonal leadership would allow me to lead the business in the way that it needed to be. And so what I found myself saying was, once I get to this point, hire the next person or put a better system in, whatever it is. It was always these external things. If we would just fix these things, then it's going to get better. I'll have more time for my family. I'll have more time to work out, more time to run, more, all these things. And what I realized, instead of like that being like this dip, this comes from Seth Godin, that I would just need to push through the slog and get up to the top of the hill, which many times that is just it. I was really in a cul-de-sac. I was going around and around, and just around the corner will be where we need to be, and then it'll get better. And then there's just more circle to go around. And it really took changing that narrative of like, this is my identity, this is what I do, and really choosing to quit and walk away. Because at that moment, I knew I didn't have the tools. Now, I mean, there's more story there about how, I kind of went and found the tools, and there's lots of like kind of life pivotal moments in there too about, again, more letting go of stories. And I think the question, if anybody's listening right now, I didn't have this language back then, but it really was what was happening. Was sometimes the stories we're telling ourselves are not getting us where we want to go? And asking that question, is the story I'm telling myself allowing me to get where I say I want to go? Can be a very powerful level setting moment. And sometimes you need community, sometimes you need a coach, sometimes you need a friend to help you ask that question and wrestle that through. Sometimes you can do it on your own. But that really was the journey that I was going through. Now I'm definitely compacting time. It took a lot longer. It didn't just happen. As far as stories usually go, they usually get, shortened in time. It took a good year and a half of processing a lot of things before those tools started to become available to me. And again, there's a lot more stories to that journey of like taking risks and walking away from certain things and, again, taking hold of new stories.
That's a great story. And there's a quote from Neil Gaiman who said, write down everything that happens in the story. And then in your second draft, make it look like you knew what you were doing all along. And I think there's a lot of truth in that. And that can be interpreted in many different ways. However, it's cool in your case to know that what you just said in those past couple minutes was years potentially condensed. And that for anybody who feels like they need to figure it out tomorrow, this week, this month, this year, you have time and it's not an overnight process. What was the moment though, or the season, or that time of awareness where you realized, hey, I need to exit this cul-de-sac and I can't stay here anymore?
Let me come back to that. I want to touch on something you just said. I think is really important for people to take a hold of. There's two things that I think most people severely misunderstand, and partly because I think there are two things that are so large and the information is so great that our brains at some level can't contain it. One of those things is time. How much time do I have? Do I have enough time? And there's lots of layers we can unpack talking about time and how that affects the way we show up in the world, how we think about time. The other one is actually perspective. And generally, we don't have enough perspective most times for the way we're feeling. There's so much more information, or as I like to describe it on our team, like a resource that we're just not aware of. And so to answer your question, for me, the exit of the cul-de-sac really was like the pressure. It was like I was looking left and right and not liking the results I was producing in my life. I had one area that I really liked the results, but I have all these other areas that I'm responsible to. My family, my first responsibility, and myself is actually another responsibility, which now later in life, I'm learning a lot more about how important that is in terms of taking care of my other responsibilities, really actually taking care of myself. Wouldn't say first, but knowing that I need to nourish my heart, I need to nourish my body. There's certain things I need in my day, in my life, for me to be my best for everybody and all the projects I'm on. So none of that was happening. And so, desperation maybe for not wanting to be in that place anymore would be part of that, like kind of pivotal shift. But again, I will say, the one thing I knew I was lacking was perspective. Like a lot of the solutions that I needed at the time, I just had no awareness of even where to look for the resources or that the resources were even available. And I will say, probably the number one thing that was lacking in my sphere at that time, which probably would have exposed me to some of the resources I needed, was community in that sphere. Not like I didn't have community, I did, but I didn't have community that was full of people that had 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, my tenure in experience around areas that like are my weaknesses, to come in and help me see how to think through things, and to shift my mindset around certain things or bring structure. And now I'm very bullish about like community mentors. I've always been bullish about mentors, but they've always, again, prospectively, most people are like, I don't even know how to find a mentor. How do I find somebody like that? Like everyone in my area, they just think this way. I don't know where to even begin to find somebody that thinks like that. Like, I get that. I've been there. So I think that was, again, I didn't know where the resources would come from, but I knew that, trying to do what I was doing and trying to fix everything while I wasn't well was never going to produce results.
Mhm. One of the reasons why this podcast exists is to help people develop perspective. And I think one of the most valuable pieces of this podcast is getting to hear stories, experiences, and getting to see how somebody else sees the world. And you and I both believe that adversities, challenges, struggles, etc., don't have to be bad things, and that we can learn and grow and develop through those things. When you look back at your life to this point, what's the hardest thing or circumstance that you've ever had to handle that you did not get to choose for yourself?
Hmm. Yeah, it's interesting. I have an idea of what might be a good story to tell for this. And although there's one criteria you just laid out that's missing
Mm.
in the story, and that is, like, I think at the time I never perceived it as adversity. I never perceived it as something that was hard. And even like later, as I looked back and actually gained more perspective on what happened, even then, I think I don't want to call it the silver lining. I always saw like, wow, what a gift.
Mm.
Like, whoa, that was crazy. It could have been worse. Whoa, like, and the more like the more of the story that unpacked, that was like the more kind of terrible parts of the story. I realized, whoa, like I can't even believe I'm here. And so I think that's the probably right story to tell. Although there might be other like smaller stories that, are maybe a little bit more relatable for people. This story I'm about to tell is somewhat unbelievable at some level. And the story is still being unfolded at some level in a lot of ways, as many of our stories are. But I think it also really goes back to the top of the conversation around the stories we choose to tell ourselves. And, you know, again, if you are someone that is struggling in this moment in life because of, and you might not even realize it, the narratives that you're telling yourself, um, you know, maybe this story will help, maybe create some perspective. I don't know. So, uh, it wasn't, this story wasn't really fully known to me until I was about 18, which is pretty interesting as well. But in the late 1970s, I was born in 1981. In the late 1970s, my biological mother, who really grew up with a narcissistic, controlling father who, unfortunately, if you understand anything about narcissism, there's usually one favorite and there's one just like gets all of the shade in the family. And unfortunately, she was that person. Um, and, a beautiful soul, beautiful heart was probably diminished, eroded over time. And really, by the time she was 17, had found a lot of comfort in the community that wasn't her family. And that community happened to be, late 1970s, early 80s, a community of drug dealers and, people that were, that had things that she never had access to, and would appreciate her in ways that she hadn't been appreciated. And she was really good at what she did. And she, like kept kind of moving up the chain in terms of like people that would have her do work in moving and smuggling and transporting drugs, all the way up to the point of like technically working under some of the key people in the Medellín cartel, which is technically, Pablo Escobar's cartel. So she was a part of it's called the Caribbean Pipeline, which would move drugs from, the Virgin Islands and other locations into Miami to Chicago. She was some part of that. Some of that history, again, is kind of lost to time. I don't know all the details of it, but in that fast, kind of crazy, Lamborghinis, Porsches, popped collars of the 1980s, she fell in love with that life. I mean, she had everything she could have ever imagined, in a lot of ways, but it was also just a very, very dangerous lifestyle. And again, condensed time here a little bit as I'm telling the story. And also, so some of these parts of the story that I'm about to say are just newly recently known to me. Even now that I'm in my 40s, I'm starting to like find new pieces of the story, which are really interesting. But in the like 1980s, there was a couple moments where she had like at least one, maybe two abortions. And shortly after that, she was on her way to Miami to do an exchange, and some other cartel people were following her, and she decided not to go to her exchange. Well, those cartel people went to the exchange and literally like murdered everybody in this, like in this building, like or whoever were at this like party or whatever. And she wasn't there. This all went down, and she got obviously scared for good reason. And we had some family at the time that lived in the Virgin Islands. And so, and she knew that area pretty well. So she got on the first flight out of Miami, didn't tell anybody, and went to the Virgin Islands. Like my parents, nobody knew where she was for like a long period of time, which is, was kind of the lifestyle at that point anyway. She would just disappear. And so she went to the Virgin Islands. She was there for maybe 6 to 9 months. And somewhere in the time period between Miami and the Virgin Islands, she happened to get pregnant. And again, living that very fast lifestyle, using a lot of drugs. And it wasn't until she was 6 months pregnant that she recognized that she was pregnant with me. And at that point, she couldn't have an abortion. And she decided to try to abort anyways by just continuing to use the drugs she was using, and heavier, like this will definitely like at some point abort the baby, right? So she does that, and then at a certain point decides that this baby's coming at some point. I should probably go back to Illinois. So she comes back to Illinois, and she comes home. Her parents obviously take her in, help her through the last parts of her pregnancy. And when she goes in to deliver, goes through delivery, I'm born, but she was so high on drugs, the delivery was super complex because, I mean, she didn't have function of her body like a human would normally have during delivery. And when I was born, I think I spent like 24 to 48 hours like detoxing from all the drugs that were in my system. So like I was born, went home, stayed with her for a few months. Obviously, she couldn't provide the care that was needed. Eventually went to my grandparents. And within like a short period of time, I think it was about 9 months old, she got picked up by the FBI on this huge sting. And in the process of that sting, they were really, I mean, she's just kind of like really low on the totem pole of what they're aiming for. So they got her to flip on a bunch of people. And I don't know how these deals get worked out, because she still went to prison for a really long time because of like, I mean, how many things she had been involved in, and they'd been following some of the people that she was connected with, et cetera, et cetera. And because she flipped on all these people, like the cartel was out for blood. And what happened was, I mean, the timing is kind of crazy, but she does this exchange so that they can have enough information to take these people down. This gets all super crazy. And my grandparents adopt me, change my last name, change my middle name, sell their house where they live, and move to like this small little farm town. And at that point in time, I'm a little baby. I don't really know any difference of anything. So I have no idea that any of this is going on. But growing up as a kid, I always knew I lived with my grandparents, but I was always told like, like I need to tell people that they're my parents. And really effectively, they were my parents growing up. I never, never called them anything different. And to this day, they're my, I describe them as mom and dad because they raised me. And what's crazy though, is even though like by a certain age, I knew that I had this biological mother that I didn't really understand who she was. But I knew she was in prison. We'd go visit her every once in a while. That's a really interesting side of the world, visiting your mother in prison. I know lots of people have that experience, so it's not solely mine. But something was really interesting though, is all of these things that were in my life that were like bad, this whole cartel thing, my mom being in prison, it wasn't bad that my grandparents were raising me, but I was always told to keep all this stuff secret. I wasn't allowed to talk to anybody about it. Well, I mean, maybe like embarrassment of the family, maybe fear of like this cartel situation, which again, I never knew about until I was like 18. And even a lot of this whole story, my grandparents kept it a secret from me. I never knew any of this. But for the longest time, as I was going through adolescence and high school, I always struggled with this idea that there was this other part of my world that no one knew about. That was like, that I'd become really good at wearing a mask. I'd really become good at the dark side of storytelling, which is fabricating something to protect myself or protect my family, whatever it might be. It wasn't until like my senior year of high school, having some really powerful experiences around faith, that I decided to like open up to one of my friends. And when I told her, it was like bricks, mountains, like the entire universe came off my shoulders. And, it was crazy. The powerfulness of like telling your story can unlock someone else's story. Who knew? She just admits to me, she goes, I've never told anybody this, but my parents, I'm adopted by them. I've never told anybody. I've hidden that this whole time. And I was like, no way, like powerful moment. And that really began the journey of me like being really curious. All of a sudden it became like not a scary thing to talk about. And I started really diving into this story and trying to understand like what's going on. Like, and that's when I learned about, how much drugs she was using, and I didn't learn about the whole story, what went down in Miami, but I knew that I was, technically should have been aborted, but I couldn't be aborted. And she knew she was pregnant with me at 6 months. I knew those parts of the story. And for me, that moment actually was one of the most pivotal moments of my life, because like there was a part of my story missing, and maybe right time, right place that I learned it. But it was like a gift when it was given to me, because it shifted my perspective about, for me personally, how much of a gift this life is. Like I shouldn't be here. That kind of became the like thought in my mind, like I shouldn't be here. And I'm here for a reason. So how can I show up with passion every day? And the word passion, the etymology of the word passion is to suffer for. How can I just show up and make sure that everything I'm doing every day, it's worth suffering for. It's worth really going for. And so again, going back to how powerful stories can be, getting the gift of that part of my story really just unlocked something for me and opened up a whole new way of being. And again, there's so much more to this story that, you know, I can unpack, and there's a part of it that might be interesting around, you know, there's a part of it that might be interesting around what happened once I turned 40 and I took a 23andMe test, if you're interested in that part of the story.
I mean, you can't leave us on a cliffhanger like that. Yeah, let's hear it.
Okay, so there's a part of the story I haven't told you so far, and that is when she came back from the Virgin Islands, when she was pregnant with me, she, for whatever reason, we still don't know, she engaged in this story, this fable, that I was a specific person she actually had been married to but got divorced from, and hadn't really seen. So like, you know, I was born in February, you do the math, she went to work it backwards. She went to the Virgin Islands in like May, and she hadn't seen him since like March. So the math never would have worked out in like this, but somehow convinced him that I was his kid. And so I'm born, and now him and his family are like grafted into my world. And for whatever reason, like ever since I was a little kid, my grandparents will tell me I would never want to be around that family. I would just be like I don't want to go there. I'm like not old enough to talk, but they could tell like something stressed me out about the family. Great family, no shade, love them a lot. They're really great people. But whatever it was, I just didn't want to be there. And when my parents finalized some of the adoption, he still had visitation rights. For a long time, he never like paid alimony, did all these kind of things. And finally, they took him to court, and then he just waived his visitation rights. And then I was really estranged from him until I was about 18. And then tried to engage with him like, you know, I'm having this kind of pivotal moment where I know more about the story. And like, he had actually reached out to me. I was like, you know, I want to give this a shot. Like, maybe there's a relationship here that's worth having. And, you know, this is a person maybe, you know, worth making amends with at some level. And it's just awkward, you know, leading to say and try to lean into that relationship. So fast forward, these people are still kind of like family in a weird way, but not like family. You might like see them at like a Christmas every once in a while, not every year. They, you know, certain aunts and uncles kind of close with, talk to them, you know, when they're through town, they might try to stop by and see my kids or something like that, you know, but just kind of very distant in a lot of ways. And I turned 40. Another key part to the story is that family is actually Japanese. And growing up, I always like kind of looked and was told like, hey, you look a little Asian, you know, and I would deny that. Another mask that I would put on, like, no, I'm not Asian. Like, I would kind of be embarrassed by that. I grew up in this little small farm town where like, really, I mean, one of the most little racist towns in middle America, you know, it's like to be any kind of nationality that wasn't like, you know, Midwest white person would be kind of looked down on, you know? So, let alone being raised by your grandparents and your mom being in prison, right? And so, I kind of denied that part of me, but always kind of interested in the Japanese culture because of being around it through them and stuff like that. And so I would be technically a quarter Japanese. So, you know, always thought that of myself. And as I got older, again, after 18, starting to like embrace the story of my life and dig into it, I started really just saying that, like, it's okay. I'm a quarter Japanese and I'm good with that. And, you know, we have kids. And we're like, you're an eighth Japanese. And like, oh, our little daughter's born, our firstborn, Lily, like, oh, look how Asian her eyes look. Like, she just has this like look to her. She looks so Asian, you know, like totally a part of my story. I'm 40. My wife gets me a 23andMe. She had just recently done one. She's like, I'll get you one for your birthday. I'm like, cool, get me one. I do it. You know, it's like, actually, it was before my birthday, but it was like on my birthday that I got the results. I'm like, turned 40. I'm like, I remember I'm like in the bathroom, just like kind of scrolling through it. And like in 23andMe, you can like go and look at your heritage. And like, I was super curious because I kind of knew what like islands a part of Japan, because Japan's a series of islands, and there's a specific island that they're that I knew they were kind of from, and I was like, oh, it'd be kind of cool to learn the heritage. And so I'm looking through, and I'm like scrolling, and like there's kind of this top level chart that shows like your background or your ethnicity and your heritage, and I don't see any Asian stuff in there. I'm like, this is weird. And so like you can like unopen carrots and scroll down, and I go down and like in like Asia, and I'm scrolling down to Japan, and I get down there and it's a 0, big old like goose egg. I'm like, wait, what? So now I'm scrolling back up. I'm like, wait, what's up here? So I'm looking, because I know my mom's side of the family, what they are. Like I've known that for a while because they know a lot about their heritage. And I'm like, what is this? And I look, and I'm like half Portuguese. Now all of a sudden, I'm like, who can I cuss on here?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Go for it.
I'm like, who the hell is my dad? Like, what in the world just happened to my world? Like in a moment.
Wow.
And like, needless to say, my wife and some close friends of ours, we turn into like Nancy Drew.
Mm-hmm.
Like we're like talking to everybody. And the first person I call is my mom, grandmother who raised me. I'm like, hey, I just took this test. And I'm looking through the results. And it says, I'm not Japanese. It says, this, and this. I was like, does that surprise you? And she goes, well, I'm not actually surprised. I go, what? What do you mean you're not surprised? She's like, well, I never thought. I'm like, oh my gosh, all these years, 40 years, you just kind of like, went along with it. And obviously then I reached out to my mother, who is a part of our life, my biological mother. I reached out to her, and I then like, again, I a lot of love towards her, but years of drug abuse has really eroded her memory and ability to like process, reality in a lot of ways. And so unfortunately, after many, many sessions of asking her tons of questions about what happened in May and when she was in Miami and who she was with and when she traveled to the Virgin Islands. And we did all the Nancy Drew. I won't go into all the details of all the people like we contacted and the layers and layers of like literally like the red lines that connect dots, trying to figure out who this could be, and really hit a dead end. So now I'm just kind of in a holding pattern. That's kind of the interesting thing about life too, is sometimes you want to tie a bow on everything in the story, and sometimes you don't you don't know. And so I'm in a holding pattern until more people take 23andMe's, and then maybe someday they'll just be this new piece of data. And so anyway, so that was interesting. I mean, one thought was like, like, who and what drug cartel am I related to? Okay, what, where was she? What does she not remember? And again, I mean, I say that in the most kindest way, but it's reality too, as well. Like there was just a lot of drugs in the 80s, and Miami was ground central for it. So
That is a wild story. And I can't help but wonder, do you feel complete as a person not having the complete picture of where you came from?
two-part answer. First part, would I like to know like the full story? I think the storyteller in me, and especially kind of the like, I like to finish the story. For the sake of the story, I would like to, go all the way down the rabbit hole and know as much as possible. But do I need that to be okay? And the answer is no, I don't. And that might be hard to believe, but I mean, it's like I'm in this moment, and everything around me in this moment is as much as I can within my authority and agency, and whatever I can't control, I'm accepting. And I'm really in love with this moment in so many ways. And it doesn't mean that everything's perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but I'm really in love with this moment. And I don't know that piece of information will like, fill some void in my life or something like that. Again, in the storytelling part of me, it would be really fun to complete the story, because at this point, who knows? I mean, who really knows? It could be wild.
Hey, maybe your biological father is listening to this podcast, in which case, reach out,
Yeah, he probably wouldn't even know. Probably wouldn't know. But if you have a kid that you think you might have a kid, no, please don't reach out.
With that being said, I do want to hear about something in your life that you did choose for yourself. And when you look back at all the years so far, what is the hardest single thing that you've chosen to do on purpose, and why did you choose to do that thing?
Mm. Yeah, this is goes right back to that 2015 kind of story. And I think it's the next part of that story that was, kind of left off. So there was a moment when I realized, okay, let me back up. There was a moment where I got additional perspective. And the perspective was, there was this thing in the world called coaching. And I won't go into like differentiating what life coaching is and executive coaching, all that kind of stuff. There was a moment in life where I found out like what coaching was and the results it was producing in people's lives. And I was all in. I was like, whatever that is, that's what's been missing, at least part of it. Like not everything, but it's a part of what's been missing. And um, it was like you found the key to a door that you haven't been able to open, but the cost of opening that door was expensive, and like figuratively really expensive. And to like go and do the training that I wanted to do at the time, I did not have the money for that. And there's a portion of my life where I spent really, really enjoying performing and creating music, and had collected would probably be the right word, collected quite a bit of musical equipment. Nothing super rare, nothing super, super special, but stuff that was really meaningful to me and that I'd curated over years. And in reality, to be able to like go and do the training I wanted to do, and to invest that kind of money and not put a hardship on my family, even though my family, my wife was like 100% behind, that's what you need to do. I totally believe in you and believe that's what you need. Like, and being in, even at that moment, being willing to like risk our, financial security to do that. I just couldn't do that. And I saw a really clear option, which was really hard, which was to sell all of this stuff, like 15, 20 grand worth of stuff, and walk away from another piece of my story, of my identity. And I think the thing for me, this is that time perspective thing coming back. I realized like, for this moment, I need a new story. And letting go of that story doesn't mean I can't pick up that story again later in life or another season. But for this season, I have to let go of that story. Even if like I have memories of doing amazing things with that piece of equipment, and like the bond I have with the brotherhood of people we made music with and all this kind of stuff. There's so much nostalgia and all that. Being willing to let go of that. And this is really the question that I had to answer at that moment. What do I want more? Like, do I want to hold on to that? Or do I want this, what at the time, future that I couldn't figure out quite how to get to? And now I saw through the keyhole, and it was there, and I had to get there somehow. And I was willing to exchange all of this for the key to unlock that door.
Dude, letting go is sometimes the hardest part.
Oh, um, it's never usually the fear of what the future will be. It's the fear of losing what you know right now.
Yeah. I mean, when you look back at that season, it sounds like that was the right move. Did you know it was the right move as soon as you did it? Or did it take some time to realize that you had made the right decision in letting go of that piece of the story for that time frame?
Oh man, dude, you never know. I mean, you can believe in yourself and you can like have belief, faith, whatever you want to call it, in the journey that you're on, but you really never know what it's going to lead to. And I mean, like, even if your vision's wicked clear, and I think that is actually a gift, just because if you can be a little bit flexible, then maybe something will come along that you didn't expect, and it will be way beyond your wildest imagination. So, I mean, I knew what I wanted, but where I am today is not where I thought it was leading.
Mm-hmm.
But I needed that journey in order to get to where I am today. Clearly needed it. And it is a fundamental piece of how I see the world and how I move through the world and how I lead the team that I lead here at Ice Barrel. It is so much of what we do at Ice Barrel, from culture to like how we keep commitments, how we're willing to have really difficult conversations, and also willing to navigate those narratives in our lives individually and as a team, all stems from that work. It would not be a part of our culture if I didn't go on that journey.
Yeah, you can't connect the dots going forward. And sometimes what we need looks very different from what we think we need. And you've alluded to this with the storytelling aspect, but we swap stories, we drop stories, we pick up stories, we create stories, we reshape stories, and stories can be long. Life requires endurance, and we don't have to dig too deep into this for the sake of time. But when you hear the word endurance, what does that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I go back to this word. I quickly go back to this word passion.
Mm.
And again, this word became really pivotal in that season of life, what I was been describing, like this kind of 2015 to 2020 window. And when I learned the etymology of that word passion, again, to suffer for, really the question became apparent to me. So what am I willing to suffer for? Like, I'd always thought about the word passion, again, since that pivotal moment where, like I learned a lot about my story around 18, and I just like became like very committed to being passionate every day. But I didn't realize that it had a connection with suffering. And for me, endurance is really this idea of like knowing that the journey that you're on, that it's worth the suffering that you're going to go through, and actually the treasures in that suffering. It's not really the end that the treasures there, that's pretty fleeting. Those ends come and go all the time. They're actually very short-lived. And if you can be committed to finding joy, happiness, significance, meaning, whatever it is you want to describe it, in the midst of the journey, and knowing that the thing that you're doing, like you're that passionate about it that you're willing to suffer for it, then I think you can endure anything.
I couldn't agree more. And I've got a quote that I'll read, and then we'll transition this into the final question where I think you can expand on all of this. So the quote is from Steve Goodyear, who said, "Those who overcome great challenges will be changed, and often in unexpected ways. For our struggles enter our lives as unwelcome guests, but they bring valuable gifts. And once the pain subsides, the gifts remain. And these gifts are life's true treasures, bought at a great price, but cannot be acquired in any other way. And I'm curious for you, Nick, if somebody's listening to this podcast and they're feeling stuck, they might be realizing after this conversation that they're in a cul-de-sac, they might be overwhelmed. They don't know how to shape their story going forward. And you get to speak to them right now in the midst of suffering, pain, challenge, adversity, etc. What would you say to them?
Well, first, you're human, and all of this is normal, and you're not alone. And if there's any narrative about your problems being so precious that you can't ask for help, or so unique that no one else will understand them, I'll tell you right now, that's a lie. It's a straight up lie. And you can choose to believe it or not. But I guarantee believing that lie, holding on to that lie, will keep you right where you're at. So that's first. Second is you need community, period. And I get that, like, some people are very community starved, but we live in the most connected world. You have more authority, agency, and access than you can imagine. And the last thing I'll say, probably the most important thing of all of this, if you're feeling stuck right where you are, it's probably because somehow along the way, where you are currently, the world you're in right now, the situations you're in right now, are not what you truly dreamed about. And it's time to stop for a moment, stop worrying about the now, and get really clear about the future and what do you want the most? You know, and it could be just, I just want to be happy. Okay, what makes you happy? I like running. Awesome. What else makes you happy? Well, I like cooking. Awesome. People always equate being stuck to like career. But stuck is really just mindset. First, we got to get clear about like what it is you want. And some people just, they haven't been clear or honest with themselves about what they really want. And they need to slow down and really touch base with that and ask a really, really difficult question of themselves. Well, why am I, this is going to be a hard question to hear for some people, why am I choosing to stay here? Another way to put that question is, why do I like it this way? Now, it sounds very insensitive, but in a way, you need to get connected with reality. And the reality is there's probably something that unconsciously you're wanting more than what you say you want. Because if you say you want this, but your results are different, then it's possible, it's very possible that there's something else your subconscious is wanting more. And there's usually 4 things that, like, again, I try not to make things super universal because I know we're all unique. We all have our unique experiences, stuff like that. But there are some very universal things across all humans. And one of these things are somatic markers. There's 4 of them: look good, feel good, be right, be in control. And one of those 4 subconsciously connected to a story that's old that might be like, hey, my dad was a lawyer. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to school to be a lawyer. I kind of hate being a lawyer, but I'm going to keep doing it because I spent all this money. And now we have this house, we have this car, we live in this really nice neighborhood. And like, I could never imagine like giving up all these things to not be a lawyer. But you only get 100,000. I mean, you spend 100,000 hours of your life in a job. There's a perspective most people don't get connected to. So it's like, okay, what is it that you want more than you say what you want? Get clear about current reality, because it's probably different than what you think it is. And it's probably connected to some really old story that's not allowing you to take hold of what the story is you really say you want. And so again, that's kind of the formula. There's no formula here, but that's at least kind of the beginning questions, the wrestling. And again, it's not impossible to do on your own. It's really helpful to do in community, and sometimes not the community you're around at this moment. Injecting some new community around you that might just have some different perspectives. And that could be your family, that could be, your community you grew up with, it could be whatever. Maybe it's not that they're a bad community, not that you don't need them. It's that, like, for your transformation, you might just need some new perspectives. And those you might have to borrow from people. And just because you don't own them yourself yet.
Man,
All right, there's so much more to it than that, but I'm like trying to condense it down. But
yeah. For people listening, if any of that seemed to resonate, just rewind and listen to that again and again and answer those questions and take some time, right? That essentially was a bit of what a coaching session could look like, right? You got a free piece of coaching from Nick, and that's the truth. And a lot of the work has to come now from your end. If you're listening to this and something struck a chord, do the work, spend some time with that. And I'll plug the Project Endure community. And one of the reasons why we started this was because there are so many people out there who might not fit in with where they grew up. They might feel like they were planted somewhere with bad soil. It's not getting watered, and they just don't know.
Yeah.
They don't know where to find that. And I really appreciate people like you, Nick, who come on this podcast and just open up, are vulnerable, are willing to tell powerful stories, share value, add insight, and change perspective. And with that being said, if somebody wants to reach out, if somebody wants to connect, they just want to follow along and learn more about you, where's the best place for someone to do that?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Yeah, I'm Nick Goodin official on Instagram. Feel free to just DM me there. I am on LinkedIn as well, but that's, like, social media plays a very small part of my life. But I do respond to my DMs on Instagram. So
Well, Nick, thank you so much for this conversation and for everything that you do. I appreciate it. I know the people listening appreciate it, and I can't wait to listen to this one back.
yeah, Joe, super grateful. And again, thankful for all the work that you're doing, and, again, building community around something that you're passionate about.
If you enjoyed this episode of the Project Endure podcast, go ahead and subscribe, leave a review on your platform of choice, and share this episode with a friend. It helps us get more conversations like this out to more people like you. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you next time. And one more thing. If you're looking for a community of people all striving to be better together, check out the Project Endure Hard Things Club. The link is in the description below. We'd love to have you.